Good day. The news that former French President Nicolas Sarkozy has been convicted on a charge of corruption, specifically of instructing his lawyer, Thierry Herzog, to offer a senior magistrate, Gilbert Azibert, a cushy job on the Côte d'Azur in return for information on an investigation on campaign financing donations that Sarkozy received from the L'Oréal heiress Liliane Bettencourt, is actually almost certainly more complicated than it looks. I would quickly add that this is only the first of a string of cases that Sarkozy is facing. He's also facing investigations over the fact that he appears to have received substantial donations for his presidential campaign from the former Libyan leader, Muammar Gaddafi. Indeed, I remember during the war that was fought in 2011 that Gaddafi's son, Saif Gaddafi, actually went on television and gave an interview and said that Gaddafi not only had largely funded Sarkozy's presidential election campaign, but that the Gaddafis had all the financial details and all the paperwork to prove it. At that time, when Sarkozy and France were leading the war against Gaddafi, the war which resulted in Libya's complete collapse, the Western media, which was enthusiastically cheering on that war, completely disregarded what Saif Gaddafi was saying. Well, it turns out that is probably true. And that brings me to the specific charges that Sarkozy has been convicted for and the various other charges that are apparently being prepared against him. This is that in France, allegations of corruption against political leaders are commonplace, and moreover, in nearly every case that I know of, when they result in prosecutions and you sift through the evidence, you quickly realize that the allegations are almost certainly true. I realize that Sarkozy, in this case, continues to protest his innocence, but I have actually personally no doubt that there is truth, or at least a large measure of truth, in these allegations. French politics are structurally corrupt, and I don't think that Sarkozy is any different in that respect from pretty much every other French politician I can think of. Even Marine Le Pen has been faced with corruption charges at various times, though I would say quickly that in my opinion, amongst French politicians, amongst the French political class as a whole, she is someone who almost certainly counts as either not corrupt or least corrupt. And this brings me, by the way, to the point about the nature of corruption in a country like France. French politics is corrupt, and if you are actually not corrupt at all, if you are an entirely honest person, then what you tend to find, as is the case, is that, as is common in most corrupt political systems, you find it almost impossible to get ahead and to break into the center of power and to achieve success in political competition. Nothing makes politicians in a corrupt political system distrust someone more than the appearance that that this other person is not corrupt or even squeaky clean. Going all the way back to the French Revolution, one of the things that was said about Maximilien Robespierre, the French revolutionary leader, was that he was incorruptible. Historians always assume that this is a compliment, this was meant as a compliment. In fact, it almost certainly wasn't. It was seen as marking out Robespierre as an outsider and as someone who was actually dangerous. And of course, Robespierre, after sending many of his enemies to the guillotine, ended up under the guillotine himself. This is a consistent pattern in corrupt societies. Those who are not corrupt will earn the absolute antipathy and loathing and resistance of those who are. I'm going to make an observation here about Donald Trump. One of the most remarkable things about Donald Trump is that despite repeated allegations of corruption which have been made against him, evidence of financial corruption on his part is extremely thin, to the point of non-existence. No convincing corruption charges have ever been made against him, and I predict the same will prove to be true of the tax evasion charges that are being looked at by the Southern District of New York. One of the reasons for the hostility towards Donald Trump that comes from so many people in Washington is that they know that they are corrupt and he is not. So, if Sarkozy's corruption is commonplace and far from unusual, why then has he been prosecuted? Why has he been singled out for prosecution when so many other people around him in the French political system are at least as corrupt and possibly even more corrupt than he is? The short answer is that France has presidential elections next year, and Sarkozy is a potential candidate, or was a potential candidate, again, until these charges were brought against him in France. In France, it is a regular event that political leaders who are seen by part of the establishment as some sort of threat will have charges brought against them and an attempt to concoct a corruption case against them. Last time, in the previous French presidential elections, it happened to Pierre Fillon, a political leader of the right associated with Sarkozy, who was in fact for a while seen as the likeliest candidate to become the president of France. He was knocked out of contention by the creation or the concoction of a corruption case against him, which involved his employment of his wife in a way that broke French law. Like the charges that have been brought against Sarkozy, I have no doubt that those charges that were brought against Fillon were true. And as is the case with the charges against Sarkozy, I am quite sure that it was not because Fillon had actually broken the law that the charges were brought against him. Fillon was unacceptable because the French political elite had already decided who they wanted to be president and were clearing the way for Emmanuel Macron. They did not want Fillon, who was too right-wing for them, too sceptical of the European Union, and who had come out against sanctions, the EU sanctions against Russia. So Fillon was knocked out of contention by the raking up of these old corruption allegations, and I think exactly the same thing has now been done with Sarkozy. Sarkozy is a threat, either an electoral threat, either to Macron or to whoever the French political class is grooming to replace Macron, given that Macron is seen as falling behind in the polls and possibly failing to mount an effective challenge to Marine Le Pen. Also, Sarkozy, since he ceased to be president, has developed close connections with the Russians, has done consultancy work with Russia, and has hinted, perhaps truthfully, that he thinks that the whole policy that the EU has been following towards Russia is a bad idea, and that perhaps the sanctions that the EU has imposed on Russia should be lifted. So Sarkozy has to be pushed out of the way, just as Fillon was, and thus you come up with old allegations of malpractice and corruption and misconduct, such as the ones relating to L'Oréal, the donations from L'Oréal, and possibly the donations from Gaddafi, and you lock him away for a short time so as to clear the path for whoever the French political establishment have decided should be anointed president of France next year. This, I'm afraid, is the way French politics works, and it's worked like that for a very long time. The last French president who, in my opinion, was genuinely not compromised by corruption to any significant extent was Charles de Gaulle, who was president in the 1960s. You have to go back that far to find someone in France who rose to the top through the conventional political system, who was not tainted by corruption. De Gaulle, of course, was a colossus. Sarkozy is not, and Sarkozy, therefore, is vulnerable. As I have said previously, if you are not corrupt in France to some extent, you will not rise, and partly the reason why you need to be corrupt in order to rise is in order to give the political class some compromising material that gives them leverage over you. Unless you do that, they won't trust you. But of course, if you do that, if you're corrupt in some way, then you have to accept that they own you. And that, I'm afraid, is the reality in France. This election, which is coming up next year in 2022, is going to be a very fraught and interesting one. As I discussed in a program that I did recently, Marine Le Pen has now is achieving a surge in the opinion polls, which appear to show that she would run equally with Macron in a vote if she got through to the second round of the French elections. That is an opinion poll rating that she has never before achieved. That shows growing dissatisfaction and unhappiness in France, which of course was already evident with the Yellow Vest protests and has now intensified since the start of the pandemic. So it'll be interesting to see whether, given that Macron himself looks like damaged goods, the French establishment decides that he must nonetheless be the person they will stick to, or whether they will opt for some unknown person no one has heard of, who they can plausibly run as an outsider, even though that person would in reality be the establishment's man. That, of course, was what happened with Macron. They ran him as the outsider, even though he was actually an insider and a fully paid up member of the establishment. We will see, but we should read this Sarkozy conviction and the various charges that have been brought against Sarkozy as a clear sign that the French establishment has made a decision and is now working to clear the path for whoever they decide is going to run against Marine Le Pen next year. Sarkozy may have been briefly considered as that person, but he's clearly no longer considered reliable, and their decision has focused on someone else. We will see whether that is Macron or whether Macron will be removed from the scene in the same ruthless way that his predecessor Francois Hollande was, or whether, if he refuses to go, some form of corruption claim will be brought against him. Interesting to watch and here on this channel. I will be watching it and reporting to you about it closely. Thank you for joining me on this program. Please check us out. Check me out on our other channels. Our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. Please also check out Alex's channel and the other channel which we now have, in which we show the programs which we make, which show the comments, the live comments that we have with viewers, which we take from our live streams. Also, please check us out on our other platforms, BitChute, Library, Odyssey, Rumble, and the rest. And please also support us through PayPal, Patreon, Subscribestar, and of course Bitcoin and things like that. Lastly, do check out our shop, the wonderful things you will find there, the amazing magic mugs, the hats, the hoodies, the sweatshirts, and of course the great t-shirts, long sleeved and short sleeved. And I look forward to you joining me for my next program, and thank you very much for joining me today.